What's up, everyone? Chris Yandel here for Channelfireball.com, and welcome to another edition of Audio Articles, where we bring you articles written by the top Magic the Gathering pros in audio form Monday through Friday, so you can listen on the go wherever and whenever you want for free. We've also got a lot of really great content on YouTube, so head over to YouTube and search for Channel Fireball and ring the bell next to the subscribe button. We also want to make it as easy as possible for you to find the podcast, so if you have an iPhone, ask Siri to play the most recent episode of Channel Fireball's podcast, and you're all set. We're also on Spotify and iTunes. Today's episode is written by Paulo, Vitor, Damo, Rosa. Paulo's going to talk about a couple of the decks that they decided not to play at Pro Tour Dominaria and the reasons why. Thanks for joining us today, and here is Decks We Didn't Play at Pro Tour Dominaria by Paulo, Vitor, Damo, Rosa. As is always the case, we try a lot of different decks throughout testing. Here are some of the more interesting ones, what was good about them, why they didn't work, and whether I think they have a future in Standard. Mono Blue Baral. For lands, 20 Island. For creatures, 4 Tempest Djinn, 4 Baral Chief of Compliance, and 4 Cryptic Serpent. For spells, 3 Essence Scatter, 3 Negate, 4 Blink of an Eye, 3 Disallow, 3 Hieroglyphic Illumination, 4 Charter Course, 4 Opt, and 4 Censor. The key card in this deck is Baral, Chief of Compliance. By making all of your spells cost 1 less, he ensures that you can cast multiple spells in a turn, such as a creature and a negate to protect it, and the cycling ability is excellent in a deck that doesn't need a lot of lands in play to operate. Baral is also a good blocker against some of the red decks. It blocks Bomat Courier, Soulscar Mage, Earthshaker Kenra, Carry Zev tokens, and attacks to enable a rated Charter Course. It's not a problem that you're running 4 of a legendary card, since you can always loot excess ones away. The best part of Baral is that it allows you to run many copies of Negate and Essence Scatter. With Baral in play, they cost only 1 mana, and the loot ability lets you cycle whichever one ends up being bad. For example, normal decks can't play this many Negates main because they might be dead in certain matchups, but this deck doesn't have a problem with that. The 2 threats in the deck, Tempest Djinn and Cryptic Serpent, are also powerful and kill very quickly. Sometimes your opponents think that you're on defense, then all of a sudden you attack with a 6-power Djinn, play another Djinn, and they're just dead next turn. That said, there were a couple of problems with the deck. The first was that some of your draws were simply underpowered. You'd bounce some stuff, cantrip here and there, and then they'd kill your first threat and you just die. For example, Black-White was a bad matchup because they had Fatal Push, Ixalan's Binding, Vraska's Contempt, and Cast Out, on top of aggressive drops that you couldn't block with Baral. If someone leads with Bomat Courier plus Carry Zev, playing a Baral means that you take 1 damage a turn. But if someone leads with Toolcraft Exemplar plus Scrap Heap Scrounger, then you're taking 6 a turn. Another problem was that there were no good sideboard cards versus red. I had the idea of a Drakehaven plus Countervailing Wind sideboard versus Control that I thought was pretty good. You'd have Censor, Illumination, and Countervailing Winds for cyclers, and then also Baral and Charter Course to trigger the discard, which would let you play the quote-unquote play a threat and counter everything they do game very well. But for red and other aggressive decks, the sideboard options are really lacking in mono blue. I'd have settled for a 1/4 creature for 2 with a bad ability, like a mono blue Contraband Kingpin, but we don't even have that as a cheap blocker. So what do we play? We thought about Labyrinth Guardian, but I think it has to be something that blocks Scrounger and Chainwhirler. I think Game 1 you're actually good versus mono red, but Game 2 becomes a problem because they bring in better removal. In Game 1, you just slam a Djinn or a Serpent, and they often have no answer, but in Game 2, they can just cast Fight with Fire, and that's a problem. Right now, the main deck is pretty tight. You want the threats, the counterspells, and the bounce, so it's hard to imagine that there's something that you'd want that's not just an upgrade over what you already have because you can't really cut anything. So for example, you'd welcome a better Blink of an Eye or a better Disallow, but that's probably about it. Most of the improvement can be done in the sideboarding, if they release a sideboard card that's actually good versus red decks, so you can match their improvements. Overall, I thought this deck was a blast to play, and it reminded me of playing Fairies. Of all the decks we tried, this was the one that I enjoyed the most, and if you like the playstyle, I recommend that you give it a try. It might not be the best deck in the world, that's probably some version of red, but it can definitely win. Blue-Black Mirari Conjecture. Early on in testing, we assumed that Black-Red and Blue-White would be the most played decks. This led us to explore one of Sam Black's ideas, Blue-Black Mirari Conjecture. This is where we ended up. For lands, 2 Island, 9 Swamp, 4 Fetid Pools, 3 Field of Ruin, 4 Drowned Catacomb, 2 Memorial to Genius, 1 Arch of Vraska, and 2 Evolving Wilds. For spells, 4 Fatal Push, 2 Duress, 4 Blink of an Eye, 1 Walk the Plank, 1 Cast Down, 1 Search for Escanta, 3 Doomfall, 2 Essence Extraction, 4 Vraska's Contempt, 3 Karn Scion of Urza, 3 The Mirari Conjecture, 1 The Eldest Reborn, 2 Never to Return, and 2 Commit to Memory. This is a tap-out control deck that relies on Mirari Conjecture to overwhelm the opponent in card advantage. Blink of an Eye is an all-star here, allowing you to return your own Mirari Conjecture to your hand if you want to, as well as bounce permanents so that you can duress or downfall them. Commit to Memory has the unique property of being both an instant and a sorcery, so you can return it with either chapter of the Mirari Conjecture. This deck was quite good versus blue-white, since you basically just ran them out of threats. It's not uncommon for you to exile all of their planeswalkers, at which point they can no longer win, no matter how many times the graveyards get shuffled back. It was also quite good against black-red. The abundance of removal meant that you can take the game to the later stages, at which point all of their dead removal would catch up to them. In the end, the deck had 2 problems. The first was mono-red, which played out very differently from red-black. Mono-red was faster, had more burn, and more importantly, had more haste creatures. A lot of our removal was sorcery speed because of Mirari Conjecture, and having to take a hit before you killed a creature was pretty bad. Hazoret was also much harder to deal with than Chandra Torch of Defiance, in part because you couldn't just duress it away. The second was green decks. Against red, you relied on some of their cards being dead or nearly useless, all of their removal. Green decks didn't have those cards. All they had were threats, and diverse threats at that. Vehicles, planeswalkers, indestructible gods, legendary creatures, and Lifecrafter's Bestiary, which meant that it was hard to deal with everything. Your best bet was probably to sideboard into the Scarab God, but that didn't always work. Ultimately, if your metagame has a lot of black-red and blue-white, you can give this a try. If it has a lot of green or mono-red, then you probably shouldn't. Temur Jhoira. At one point in testing, we really liked Karn's Temporal Sundering. Our idea was to make a deck that could rely on chaining them together through the use of Jhoira Weatherlight Captain and Weatherlight. If you have Weatherlight in play, you can crew it, attack, cast Karn's Temporal Sundering, and attack again, which gives you an extra 10 looks at finding a second copy of Temporal Sundering. In an emergency, you could return your own Mox Amber to your hand, which would draw you an extra card with Jhoira and also add an extra mana. The final build that we got to utilized Song of Freyalise as a way to generate mana to go through a lot of your deck in a Jhoira turn. Here's where we ended up. For lands, 1 Island, 4 Forest, 2 Spirebluff Canal, 3 Rootbound Crag, 2 Hinterland Harbor, 4 Botanical Sanctum, and 4 Aether Hub. For creatures, 3 Rishkar Pima Renegade, 3 Avia Pashiri Sage Lifecrafter, 1 Merfolk Branchwalker, 4 Llanowar Elves, 3 Pia Nalar, 4 Jhoira Weatherlight Captain, and 4 Walking Ballista. For spells, 3 Saproling Migration, 3 Mox Amber, 4 Karn's Temporal Sundering, 4 Song of Freyalise, and 3 Weatherlight. The main problem with this deck was, well, red. The combination of easy ways to kill Jhoira, a Braid, Lightning Strike, plus Goblin Chainwhirler, which was just devastating, made the matchup very hard. You could reasonably cut Saproling Migration. We tried Servant of the Conduit as well, or more Branchwalkers, but Chainwhirler would still kill Llanowar Elves, tokens from Pia, and tokens from Avia Pashiri. In the end, Chainwhirler proved to be too oppressive, and we abandoned the deck. Since Goblin Chainwhirler is so popular, I don't think this is a deck you can play. If it gets banned, however, I'll be revisiting Temur Jhoira. Jeskai Legends. This was a deck that showed up on Magic Online, and for a while, we took as a serious contender. For lands, 5 Island, 5 Mountain, 4 Clifftop Retreat, 4 Irrigated Farmland, 4 Spirebluff Canal, and 4 Sulphur Falls. For creatures, 4 Baral Chief of Compliance, and 1 Squee the Immortal. For spells, 4 Teferi Hero of Dominaria, 1 Jaya's Immolating Inferno, 4 Karn's Temporal Sundering, 3 Abrade, 3 Blink of an Eye, 3 Chandra Torch of Defiance, 3 Magma Spray, 3 Syncopate, 3 Karn Scion of Urza, 1 Search for Escanta, and 1 Negate. The main appeal of this deck is that Baral Chief of Compliance is just a very good card. It was great at enabling and accelerating Karn's Temporal Sundering, and if you ever cast a Time Walk with any of the deck's Planeswalkers in play, you felt pretty good. Our list was mostly the same as the one on Magic Online, except we added Squee the Immortal. We really liked the 1 Squee as a way of having a reliable legend, and it kind of worked as a blocker. Ultimately, though, the deck was just a little too weak. The Planeswalkers by themselves weren't truly capable of winning the game. Karn was just bad, and we often had Karn's Temporal Sundering stuck in hand. I don't think this deck has anywhere to go, unfortunately. Blue-White Historic. This was yet another attempt at making Karn's Temporal Sundering work in conjunction with Baral. This was the deck Steve Rubin initially built. For lands, 2 Field of Ruin, 1 Memorial to Genius, 4 Irrigated Farmland, 4 Glacial Fortress, 6 Island, and 8 Plains. For creatures, 4 Baral, Chief of Compliance, and 2 Wrath-Capashen, Ship's Mage. For spells, 4 Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, 2 Wizard's Retort, 2 Urza's Ruinous Blast, 3 Karn, Scion of Urza, 2 Gideon of the Trials, 1 Essence Scatter, 2 Syncopate, 2 Gideon's Reproach, 4 Karn's Temporal Sundering, 1 Negate, 2 Supreme Will, 2 Settle the Wreckage, and 2 Blink of an Eye. In the end, I liked some of what this deck was doing, but I wasn't a fan of Karn's Temporal Sundering specifically. It just wasn't good enough when it worked to justify the times it didn't. Instead, I wanted to make a more aggro control approach happen, similar to how decks were configured when the format first started being played. The card I wanted in particular was History of Benalia. As it's good against aggro, it gives you 2 blockers and Vigilance helps with racing, and good against control, it gives you 2 attackers that can't be hit by Seal Away. Playing 1 or 2 threats and then mostly reacting to what they were doing seemed pretty good to me. This is the best version of what I tried. Blue-White Historic. For lands, 4 Glacial Fortress, 2 Field of Ruin, 4 Irrigated Farmland, 7 Island, and 8 Plains. For creatures, 4 Walking Ballista, 3 Knight of Grace, 2 Lyra Dawnbringer, and 2 Wrath-Capashen, Ship's Mage. For spells, 4 Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, 2 Karn, Scion of Urza, 2 Gideon of the Trials, 2 Seal Away, 4 History of Benalia, 1 Fumigate, 3 Cast Out, 2 Negate, 2 Supreme Will, 1 Settle the Wreckage, 1 Gideon's Reproach, and 1 Censor. There's also a different version with Heart of Kirin and more Karns and Gideons, but I think this is the best one. In the end, this deck still felt weak to red-black, especially to Goblin Chainwhirler, but not for the reasons you'd expect. It was weak versus Chainwhirler because it had First Strike. As a 3/3 First Striker, it could block History of Benalia tokens all day. Rekindling Phoenix was similarly problematic, except it could also block Wrath-Capashen. The fact that your removal required them to attack was an issue, and I found myself having to rely on keeping a Lyra Dawnbringer in play to beat this type of deck. If they had a way to kill it, you just lost the game, which was a problem. Still, I thought that this deck was great versus the control decks, and it wasn't actually bad versus red, which makes me think that it could be worked on some more. It's similar in playstyle to the Mono Blue deck, except that I know the cards to make it different exist. For Mono Blue, they have to be printed, and for Blue-White Historic, they just have to be found. For this reason, this is the deck I'm still trying to make work, and if you like the playstyle, I urge you to try some games with it to see if you can find improvement somewhere. That does it for this episode of Audio Articles. Make sure to head over to channelfireball.com and leave Paulo a comment about what you thought about today's article, or you can hit him up on Twitter at PVDDR. Paulo's also got a new venture called spikesacademy.com where he teaches people how to up their game in Magic, so hit him up on Twitter in the DMs for more details. Also make sure to check out cfbevents.com. You'll find all the information about the upcoming GPs there. Follow us on Instagram and Twitter, and make sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Thanks for joining us today, and I hope to see you soon. And until then,